Hello, future travelers, wherever you are from, and whomever you are. I want to give you a recounting of my personal experience living through the great pandemic of 2020. Where do we start? So, there's been many pandemics throughout human history. The Black Plague was one of the more notable ones. There was the plague of Justinian, the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. But in 2020, at the beginning of the year, starting perhaps in January, although, some say that the pandemic started even earlier than that, perhaps in November or December of 2019. It's started, most scientists and most academics would agree that it started in China, in the city of Wuhan. There's debate as to exactly what happened and why it started and what caused it to start. The most prevalent theory at the moment is that it started at a wet market in Wuhan. So there was a market that sold animals and animal products, and these animals were kept in cages. They were live animals, and there was some of these animals who were kept in cages. They had a strain of this disease, this coronavirus, this new disease, and there was something called a zoonotic jump. That is to say that the disease was prevalent in the animals, but then it made a jump to humans, and this can happen where a particular disease. In this case, it was a virus, so it was a coronavirus. This a particular type of virus. I think the name derives from the shape of the outer shell of the virus, which has crown-like. It's a crown-like shape that it uses to attach onto things. So that's where the name corona comes from. It's a type of virus, and it apparently was in some animals, and there's some talk and some speculation that there was several jumps, that it came from maybe a bat, and then it migrated to a pangolin, which is a type of animal, and then to humans, or through something. We don't really know. There was some speculation that perhaps it jumped through various animals, or maybe one, but there has been talks about bats and pangolins and perhaps other animals. There's one theory I remember, which was it started in a bat somewhere, and then it moved its way into a pangolin, and then it made a zoonotic jump to humans, and then it started to infect humans in Wuhan, and around this market. That was the first epicenter. There's an alternative theory that it was generated or escaped from some type of medical or military facility, or a research facility in Wuhan, China. I don't know. I don't know if that's true, but there is some speculation that this virus was generated by humans, and that it was intentionally released, or was perhaps accidentally released. I'm more convinced by the first theory, which is that it was natural, and that as a result of our close proximity to animals in sort of an unnatural way, that we were keeping them in cages, and we had close proximity to these animals. Inevitably, some of their diseases, which was novel to our immune system, would make that jump. So, and this has been recorded before. They speculate the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 derived from chickens, perhaps, in the United States. There's some speculation, and there's been a lot of talk in recent years about avian flu and the virus or something similar to a coronavirus jumping from birds to humans. So often viruses, when the viruses need to find a host, right? So the virus needs to find a host, and sometimes they find a host in a different species, and the virus mutates or evolves to infect a different host. So that's where it began in Wuhan, in China, presumably in November, December 2019. The news of it became a bit more prevalent in January 2020. I recall that international news was starting to pick up this crazy virus that was happening in China, and then by February, it had spread to Japan, to South Korea. There was this virus that was now, everybody was in Asia, at least we're talking about it. People in the West were becoming aware of it. I remember that I was in Japan in February of 2020. This was before things got really, really crazy. I was in Japan. I was in Tokyo, Osaka, Fukuoka in the south. And there, people were wearing masks. There was talk that there's this virus spreading around. It had not become that serious yet, but certainly there was people you were talking to were saying, I got to be careful. There's this virus that originated from China, and it's spreading. But I didn't realize how significant this virus would be. I thought it would be a localized virus. And we've had vocalized viruses in the past. About 10, 15 years ago in Toronto, where I'm from, there was something called SARS. It was a virus that was locally. It was I don't know where it came from. I don't remember where it came from. I don't think it was endemic in the sense that it was from Toronto, but I remember that it spread quite quickly, mainly through the hospitals in Toronto and perhaps surrounding areas, and it's quite big news. Well, it's nothing compared to the pandemic, the great pandemic of 2020. It was generally just a localized viral outbreak. But for us at the time, it was considered very big news, and I remember people were quite scared. But it passed. It didn't end up killing the entire population. There were no lockdowns. It passed, and so my experience with viruses and large outbreaks was only SARS in the past. So I was completely unprepared to what was going to happen after. I came back to Canada in February, and I remember hosting a Chinese New Year's party, which would ironically be one of the last for a while, because subsequently there were lockdowns, but it would have been one of the last big events I would host for a while. We had lots of people over at my place, and there was some talk in February when I came back to Canada about this coronavirus. It was spreading. Some of my friends were more concerned than others. Some of them were saying, "Ah, and it's just." Some of them were not even aware of it, but some of them were very concerned. They're like, "Oh, what if it comes here? What if it spreads?" I was I was not as concerned. Don't know why. I just maybe it was because of my experience with SARS previously that it was localized. Yes, it was terrible, but um, if you sanitize your hands, wear a mask, and just everything would go away. And I had no concept of the scale of the damage this virus would do. So in February I was back, and there was some talk, and no one was. I think the general population, at least in Canada, was not that concerned. And then March rolls around, and then things got really serious. So by now the virus was spreading from China. I think it first spread to Europe. There were infections in places like Italy and other places in Europe, and it has spread by way of international travel, right? So it made its way to very quickly to every corner of the world through international travel, through the ease by which people could travel through flights and international flights. So I remember there was a John Hopkins based simulation. Sort of, you can track where the virus was. It was a map of the world with these red circles indicating the number of infections and where the infections were, almost like a video game in a way, which was a way that you could track the coronavirus in the beginning. And then another very popular website later on was a Worldometer. And I remember later on we would always be on the Worldometer checking infections and the number of people who had died. And it just almost became a daily obsession to check coronavirus statistics. But back in March 2020, I was checking this app, this John Hopkins app, this website where they, again, there was a black map of the world with red circles, and the size of the circle represented the number of infections and number of people killed. And certainly the epicenter was in China, and by then, in March, from what I recall, and probably even before March, Wuhan had gone into complete lockdown. We did not suspect something like that would happen in Canada. But Wuhan had, I don't remember exactly which month it was. Maybe it was February or March or earlier. My memory is a little bit fuzzy when it comes to the exact dates during that period of time. But the city of Wuhan in China, the epicenter of the coronavirus, it certainly had gone into complete lockdown, that you couldn't enter and leave the city. And that was foreboding and foreshadowing in terms of what the rest of the world would do very soon. So back in Canada in March, things happened really quickly. I remember things, and it was very confusing. Life was normal one week, and we were going about our business and doing whatever. I was still running my law firm at the time. We were meeting people in person. All that would change. And I remember the moment for me personally that I remember when things got really serious, that I realized that this is not just something that was trivial. Was I had tickets to the Maple Leafs game in mid-March. So the Maple Leafs are our hockey team in Toronto, and hockey is considered a national pastime in Canada. So it's considered a very important sport. And the hockey game was canceled. They never cancel hockey games. So that's when I thought, okay, things are getting serious here. Things are getting very serious, because a hockey game has has been canceled. At least for me, that was when I knew that something was up. They had canceled the hockey game obviously because they didn't want the disease to be spreading in large areas where there were lots of people, concentration of people, and then other things started to get canceled, right? Events and outdoor events, indoor events, large events. Suddenly, within the same week, they were canceled. Everything started to get canceled. The hockey game, I think, was Wednesday or Thursday, and by Friday and Monday that week, I remember on Monday that week, everything was okay. I was, on Monday on that week in Toronto, I was in the grocery store, the local grocery store, and everything was fine. There was no panic. There certainly wasn't any panic. But the hockey game was canceled, and then other things were canceled. And by Friday, I went to the grocery store, and there were a lot of the shelves were empty. I've never seen this in my life. Never seen anything like that in my entire life. The shelves were just empty. A lot of the non-perishable food items, all gone from the shelves. And funny enough, toilet paper became a big hot commodity during this period of the pandemic. Everybody was grabbing paper, especially toilet paper. It was like impossible to find toilet paper. Just very weird, but toilet paper became such a hot commodity. But yeah, I did a massive shopping trip because everybody was grabbing things from the store, and I joined the bandwagon. I was freaking out. Obviously, something terrible and very something on a very large scale was happening. I never seen shelves empty like that in Canada. So I grabbed what I could. I was living with my girlfriend at the time. I still am, but at the time we lived in a condo in downtown Toronto in early 2020, and we grabbed what we could. We had a massive shopping trip. We stocked up like everybody else. Just the panic was setting in, and it just strange. It was just strange to see people grabbing things and buying things and hoarding. I had never seen hoarding before like this, but people were hoarding. And then on occasion you saw as well one person that didn't seem to get the memo, or they were just in a completely different mode. I remember quite distinctly at that grocery store when we were doing all of the hoarding. There was one girl in a beautiful dress, and she had flowers, and she was obviously going on a date or something. Just such an interesting contrast. Everyone else was hoarding food and getting ready for the apocalypse, for the end of the world, and just one girl, this beautiful girl. She was just buying flowers, nothing else. Wasn't hoarding. She was just buying flowers, and she was high heels, dressed in nice dress, going on a date or an anniversary, and just the contrast. I still have this image in my head of this girl just buying flowers. Just such a powerful image, and later on, the people divorced during the pandemic, right? Love was very very difficult because, and finding new love was very difficult as well for a lot of people because of the lockdowns that would happen subsequently. So. There was some premonition here. There was some foreshadowing as to how we would live our lives for the next year, the next 2 years. So that's when in March, when things shut down, and we started to get official correspondence from our government at that time to stay indoors. And there was now official correspondence on news channels that the government advised us to stay indoors. There was no official lockdown yet. That would happen very soon. Within a couple of days, there was now lockdown. That you were advised just not to go outside, and restaurants were closed, and everything was closed, except for essential services like banks, I think, and other things deemed essential. Um, but yeah, there was during that week, it was very nerve wracking. I remember spending most of that week afraid. I became a hypochondriac. I thought I was sick. I thought that I had the virus. I was taking all of these supplements, oil of oregano, other supplements such as echinacea. I was convinced I was sick. I don't think I had the virus, but I was so convinced that I did. I was freaking out, and I spent a lot of time on the internet looking at news articles and looking at these news articles, YouTube videos, trying to understand this virus more. I was doing a lot of that, and I was obsessively looking at news articles, obsessively reading about this virus, learning about this virus, and it became almost a full-time job. I was doing it hours and hours. I was not doing anything else. I was not working. I was like anxious. I was highly anxious and paranoid, and maybe I like many other people. I think it was just very scary. It was a frightening time to have the world change all of a sudden, and then we got the official word from the government that everything was shutting down. From the Canadian government that the Canadian government shut down restaurants, large social gatherings, any social gathering really. I think of more than there. There were so many lockdowns that happened after different incarnations of lockdown. Because subsequently they would let us out and then they would lock us down. They would let us out. They would lock us down. There was, I think, 4 or 5 different lockdowns of different degrees and different rules and different. But the initial one, the big one, was the most shocking, because this was the first lockdown, and the Canadian government repatriated a lot of its citizens, flew everybody in from different countries, and because the world then around that time was also, most of the world was implementing some level of lockdown. At one point, I think half the world was under some, or if not more than half the world was under some type of lockdown mandate, that you could not attend social events, restaurants were closed, theaters, things, just any social gathering was closed. Sorry, I'm filming a video right now. Can you come back later?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. That was just room service. And yeah, just I just remember for me, there was a part of me that thought maybe this was the big one. Like the big one, like this was it. This was the end, the actual end of days, the end of the world. This was there's a part of me that actually had that thought, that maybe this was it, the big one, right? That we'd all be wiped out, we'd all be dead, because the news items and the videos coming out were terrible. Dead bodies in morgues, hospitals overrun with patients, people dying on the streets. You had these videos coming out of China, coming out of Europe, that were horrific. YouTube videos of people who had family members die in their homes. We were inundated with this deluge of images and videos of death, of disease, of human suffering. It was terrible. It felt like it was the end. That it was. If you were to only look at the news articles and not look at anything else. And again, I was trying to educate myself as best I could. But truly, I had the thought that maybe we were all going to die, all of us, not all, like all of humans. That this was it. This was the big one, right? There would be no humans left. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. We're still here. This is now May 2024. We're still all here. There's a lot of problems in the world right now, but we're still all here. Well, not all of us. Many of us didn't make it, but the majority of us survived. The majority of us did survive. Lockdown happens in March 2020, and I remember then I was not allowed to do anything. Banks were still open, so I remember making a couple of deposits just really quickly. I was just so scared, just running down the street. I remember going to my office to collect some mail, and I had a mask on, and I was just running across the street, just afraid I would touch anything or come in contact with anyone. I had no idea, it was just scary. I remember running to my office, physically running, and there was no one on the street except for a couple of homeless people who were just wandering around. But the streets by now in Toronto were empty. It was completely empty. It was like the apocalypse. It was just empty silence. There was just silence. This solemn, grave silence, like we were in one very large cemetery. No cars, very few people, if any. And the people who were walking around generally were people who had no homes. They had no place to go. Unimaginable. Completely unimaginable. So there's someone trying to call me. I'm going to have to pick up this phone. I will continue the video, and I'll see if I can do this at the same time. Hello? Yeah, hi, how are you? Oh, yes, please. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I was filming a video. I didn't realize that was the gift. Okay, send her back in. Please send her back in. Okay, thank you. I'm getting a gift. So that was what the knocking was for. Anyways. Yeah, it was just so. It was so bizarre and frightening. So I stayed at home, and my girlfriend and I stayed in bed. We watched a lot of videos, not Netflix. Netflix is a streaming service. By the time you watch this video in the future, I don't know if Netflix would exist, if it will be something that even makes sense to you. In the same way that Blockbuster, I'm not too sure if, for those of you watching, you even know what Blockbuster is. It used to be a video rental service. Netflix may not exist by the time you watch this video, but it was a way for you to watch videos online. And I remember being unable to watch videos or anything unrelated to disease. It seemed like nothing else in the world at the time was even remotely relevant. So I think this is my gift. Sorry, I'm filming a video, but you can come in. Please come in. Yeah, you can go into the living room area. I'm just going to continue to film if you don't mind, because it's a continuous video, and I'm in the middle of it, so I'm not going to stop filming. But yeah, you can. For those of you watching at home, I just got a gift. Hi, do you want to say hi to the video?
Hi.
Oh, there we are.
Welcome to Romania.
Okay.
And I feel very sorry because I disturbed you.
That's okay. Don't worry about it.
It's our gift for
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Sir.
Thank you very much.
Have a
Okay.
nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. So yeah, I'm getting some gifts, as you can see from the hotel. Uh, yes, it was. I couldn't watch any videos uh, that were unrelated to disease. Nothing because nothing was relevant. You'd watch action movies and they seem just fanciful, or movies involving crowds of people, and it's not like, are we going to even have crowds of people in the future gathering in one place? Like, you would watch movies where people would be walking around in a city. It's like, it's not even happening. It's so irrelevant. Nothing. Romance movies seem irrelevant. Horror movies, don't need to watch horror. Like, look around you. There's no need to watch horror movies. Sci-fi, no need for that. We were living in a sci-fi world. Our reality was stranger than fiction. Our reality was nothing in fiction could surpass what we were living through. Fiction seemed irrelevant. Made up stories of catastrophe, adventure, or love or drama seemed completely irrelevant. The only thing that I could watch were movies about disease. It seemed to be the only thing relevant. And again, I thought maybe this was it. This was the big one, that like there's no point watching anything else. Psychologically, perhaps I was interested in watching movies about disease because it maybe gave me some sense of control over what was happening, and some small sense of of control. I remember during the pandemic, at least the beginning, a very popular board game was called Pandemic. A lot of people bought this board game because it gave them some sense of control. And video games related to disease became very popular because it gave us some semblance of control. So the no March 2020, that was a very difficult month, and we were locked down in April. April was strangely the opposite. It By the time April rolled around, like something very strange happened. Like psychologically, the anxiety started to pass. I thought this lockdown would last for 2 weeks, right? I thought maybe like we'd be locked down for 2 weeks, we'd be able to go back outside, and life would continue. That was my thought. I was terribly wrong about that. I completely underestimated the length of this pandemic, and I think a lot of people did. I thought I'd be back in the office in 2 weeks, right? By the end of the pandemic, the office had closed. Like the office itself had closed. They had no more clients and customers. The office had closed. I had to change offices by the end of the pandemic. I was paying, business rent, for nothing. That was one of the economic issues that a lot of business owners were facing. We were paying rent for an office that we were not using. So I canceled my lease, and my law firm went virtual. But I thought it was 2 weeks. I thought, I thought just 2 weeks. I'd be back in the office. I'd be seeing clients. Life would be normal. I'd be seeing friends, and none of that. None of that happened, unfortunately. I'm just gonna put the video down for a second. Where the video camera? I'm just gonna check my phone. Where is my phone? Oh my. Okay, I don't even have my phone. I was gonna check my phone about something, but I will. 1 second. I'm just gonna continue. I'm just gonna pause for a second. There's something I have to check. I'm just gonna put the camera down. I'll be right back. Yeah, sorry about that because this is a long video. There's actually I'm also working remotely in Romania, and I have to on occasion respond to clients, and I have to. I was checking. I have the phone I'm recording from is not the phone that I text and email from. So I have two phones. So I had to respond to a client. Apologies. Yeah. So April was April was weird. Time was seemed very different in April. March was anxiety, just anxiety, and every day was difficult, and I thought I was sick, and I thought the world was ending. In April, well, the world didn't end, right? By the time we got to April, we were locked down. Lockdown was extended. We were just now at home, and things just were very I don't know, they were very slow. They were slow, but we got into a routine of just staying at home. We adjusted. You know, humans are really marvelous that way, in that we have the ability to adjust to different circumstances. And my girlfriend and I, we adjusted. We would do these things called bednicks. We made that term up. So we would have a picnic in bed because we couldn't go outside. So we would, order supplies from grocery stores. So we would have them ordered to our condo. So the food would show up. So we learned how to do online shopping. We used a lot of Amazon. So as well, Amazon is I don't know if Amazon would exist by the time you watch this video, but Amazon's an online retailer. And it's more than that, but it's predominantly in 2020 it was an online retailer where you can order items directly to your home. It became very popular during the pandemic because people were not going outside. So again, economies and behavior changed dramatically because we were stuck inside. There was a conferencing video app called Zoom that became very popular, and people are now video conferencing each other more often than seeing each other in person. So a lot of changes in human behavior and in the way that we're using technology, in the way that we interact, and I think the implications of this way of doing things certainly has pervaded and has continued since the pandemic, for sure. I think the pandemic permanently, in a way, changed behavior for at least this generation of people. April was April was very bizarre. It was yeah, we just spent a lot of time indoors, um, and time just flew. And strangely, I actually felt happy in April, which is really bizarre because in March I was freaked out that I would die and the world was coming to an end. In April, things just calmed down. You're just indoors. You were not dead. You were still alive, and you got into this routine of just living life indoors, almost like a prison, but I guess house arrest, forced house arrest in a way. And there were moments I remember I was actually genuinely happy that it was a good break from a busy life, right? Because prior to the pandemic, every day was very busy for me. I would go to the office, I would meet clients, I did a lot of legal work, and it was an interesting break to just be at home, working from my computer a couple hours a day, and I was still communicating with my staff, and we were able to still run the law firm remotely. Uh, so we got used to this routine. And I genuinely remember that there were moments where I actually felt at peace, um, blissful, just relaxed, meditative. Again, I was I was of the mistaken view that the pandemic would just then be over by May 2020, right? Like, okay, well then just enjoy this time off. Think of it as an extended vacation. We're we would call it a staycation, right? Collapsing the word stay and vacation, a staycation. It's neologism. That's the new word that some people have invented. I don't think it's actually in the dictionary, but staycation. It was a sort of forced staycation for us. And then May comes around, um, and the pandemic's not over. But I think by the summer, now here's where my memory is a little bit fuzzy. So my dates are going to be a little bit off. But generally speaking, by the summer, or I think by the beginning of the summer, we were allowed to now leave our homes, and we could, I think, attend. I'm not too sure if I think we were able to go to restaurants, and at least certain things were open again. So the first phase had passed, and we were slowly reintegrated back into the world. Um, and in other places in the world, I think that happened as well. That the numbers of infection, because of the lockdown, the numbers had dropped, and people were allowed to go out. I remember at this time I was reading in the news that there was a big celebration on Charles Bridge in Prague, which is one of my favorite cities. You could look at my other videos about Charles Bridge, but there's a huge celebration, and there was a sense, at least in some cities, that finally things were going back to normal. That there was a catharsis in May or June for at least some people in some places in the world, because this was truly a global phenomenon. Other places perhaps are still in lockdown. Other places never locked down. Sweden was an outlier. I don't think they, at this point in time, locked down at all. The chief epidemiologist of the country believed that if more people just interact with the virus, they would reach something called herd immunity, which is that there would be enough people who would develop natural immunity, and immunity was considered a good thing. So instead of locking people down and not exposing people to the virus, this particular epidemiologist at this time believed in having people just exist with the virus, which was a controversial decision and sort of an outlier among nations, but a very interesting approach at the time. But most countries had lockdown. And by this time, by the summer, we were let out again, like almost like animals let out from our cages into the world that we can interact, or perhaps like prisoners, we were given some sunshine and some time to walk around the courtyard. But this would not last. This would not last, and there was a resurgence. I think in late summer or by the fall. I think by the fall. By there again, my memory is going to be a little bit fuzzy here in terms of the exact dates, but certainly there was a resurgence, and we went back inside, and there was another lockdown mandate. I think in total in Toronto there were 4 or 5 over a 2-year period from 2022. The middle or beginning of 2022, there over a 2-year period, there were at least 4 or 5 different lockdowns. So I described it like a yo-yo, in that they would let us out, they would then push us back indoors, and they would let us out, and it was terrible. Psychologically, it was terrible, because you would have these moments of freedom, and then you would lose that freedom, and you would be forced to go back indoors. Which was psychologically a terrible experience. I thought maybe it would have been almost better psychologically to just stay indoors, right? And then you get used to that routine. But to taste freedom and to lose it again, and to taste freedom and to lose it again, it was psychologically devastating, especially for me, because I'm a big fan of travel, and travel was certainly quite restrictive during this time. I traveled to Ottawa in the fall, and again everything was traveling during lockdown. I was just traveling domestically. I think my girlfriend and I made a trip to Vancouver. We were traveling domestically. I think either unable to do international travel or at the time, or I think certain flights were canceled, and then they were reintroduced, but then they were canceled again, and there were quarantine hotels later on. Again, I mean, I'm just one person, right? The history of the pandemic has been recorded in many by many other people through many other sources, but the psychological effect of lockdown and then released in lockdown was caused me, for example, an extreme amount of anger and dissatisfaction, and a sense of betrayal. Personally, I felt a sense of betrayal and a sense of anger towards my own government, towards the Canadian government, and I never felt this way before. By the end of the pandemic, I went from becoming very patriotic, and I've always been historically a very patriotic person, and I thought Canada was the best country in the world. I was very happy to be living in Canada. I went from a patriotic person to a person who is not patriotic. And I went from loving Toronto to having a very ambivalent, apathetic, mixed view of Toronto. And this happened during the course of the pandemic. I personally fell out of love with my own country as a result of predominantly the lockdowns and the way that lockdowns were implemented. And the first lockdown, the reason behind it was saving lives, right? We needed to save lives. That's understood. And I promote it on social media and on my channels of communication. I encourage people to stay at home and to obey lockdown orders and not to cheat the system. But the subsequent lockdowns were very different. They weren't about saving lives, not in that sense anymore. They were about hospital capacity. It was, well, we don't have enough room in our hospitals, so we're going to shut down the economy. What? You would rather shut down the economy than just create more hospital capacity and to have more hospital capacity? Apparently, they couldn't create more hospital capacity. It was easier for the politicians and the people in charge to just shut down the economy. Right? If you think about that logically, it didn't make a lot of sense. And I've talked to my doctor friends about this. I have a lot of friends in the medical community, and they said, well, one of the key shortages were skilled nurses. They said that skilled nurses, skilled nurse practitioners was actually the huge bottleneck. I talked to two doctors who in Ontario who gave me very similar feedback that when it came to capacity, it was not necessarily space. Space could be made. It was not necessarily the doctors. But again, this is the perspective of two individuals, so it's a small sample size. But it was surprisingly consistent. This feedback. It was just the lack of skilled nurses and assistants within the medical field. That was the bottleneck. That it was about nurses. I mean, I don't think it was only about nurses, but let's suppose it was about nurses and to an extent doctors and physical capacity of the hospitals, medical equipment, medical rooms. Could that not have been addressed? The government gave out billions, the Canadian government, billions of dollars in something called CERB, C-E-R-B, which was income replacement, right? Essentially basic income for everyone. That's free money. Which subsequently caused a lot of inflation. That's a different topic. But it was given out freely and sometimes inappropriately to almost everyone who applied for it. It was billions and billions of dollars. The Canadian government went into massive public debt, the most amount of debt it had gone through that since the Second World War, the most amount of debt that it had incurred since the Second World War. It was 2020, and that it handed out free money to everybody because during the pandemic, during the lockdown, a lot of people couldn't work, right? Because you had to physically go to work, and now you were not allowed to go to the workplace. My entire team went home. We were not allowed to physically meet in the office. So in order to compensate people for the fact that they were unable to work, the government gave Canadian citizens and I guess even perhaps non-citizens, I don't exactly remember the criteria, but billions of dollars in aid along with other types of aid through other programs or given out. Could this money not have gone to increasing hospital capacity, hiring more nurses, training more nurses, fast tracking foreign trained nurses, fast tracking nursing students, making that a priority in the fall of 2020? That would have made more sense to me had the government actually consulted with medical professionals. Again, very small sample size. I talked to two doctors, both close friends of mine. I'm not an expert in the medical field. I have a health science degree, like I have a pre-med degree, so I know probably more than the average person, but I'm no expert on this. But it seemed that instead of shutting down the economy again and putting everybody back into lockdown, shutting down theaters and restaurants and workplaces, just increase hospital capacity. So the second set of lockdown, starting in the fall of 2020, that really angered me. And I transformed from a pro-lockdown person into an anti-lockdown person very quickly because I didn't agree with the second set of lockdown and the third and the fourth. And they were even more egregious by then because by then we had understood the virus a lot more and that it was absolutely, certainly it was deadly, but it was not as deadly and as we thought it was, that it looked like it could somewhat be controlled. Somewhat, obviously, it was still terrible and deadly, but it wasn't the end of the world. By February, not February, sorry, by fall of 2020, I think most people came to the conclusion that that this was not going to end humanity because the people who were infected, the majority of these people did, well, I wouldn't say the majority, but many of them recovered. Many of them recovered, and it didn't kill as many. Well, it's all relative, right? It wasn't apocalyptic, let's put it that way. It did kill a lot of people, but it wasn't apocalyptic. It didn't end the human race. So I think relative to the fears, at least my fears of March 2020, when I thought this potentially could end the human race, it was less less bad, right? It's all relative when you're dealing with global catastrophic events. It's all relative, right? So within that scale of relativity, at least, it wasn't that bad, and it seemed like we were going to survive, like humanity was going to survive, and Toronto was going to survive, Canada was going to survive. It was not the end of the world. So we were under lockdown again, and that was terrible for me psychologically. I did some localized traveling, and I think in September, was it September, October? I think October. I went to the Netherlands. So my girlfriend and I spent 5 weeks in Amsterdam and surrounding area. So interestingly, because I was hopping around a little bit during this time, other countries their rules were different. But by the time I got to Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, they were not under lockdown. Which was interesting. So we had a couple of days where life was very normal, and then they went into lockdown while I was there. So then everything shut down. So just again, fascinating. Spent 5 weeks in the Netherlands. Came back to Toronto, and I had to quarantine for 2 weeks. There's a video actually about me in quarantine where I'm opening up some presents for my girlfriend, and it's a video from that time of me in quarantine in my pajamas. By January of 2023, the Canadian government had introduced quarantine hotels, which made travel in and out of Canada even more difficult. In that, if you came back to Canada, you were forced to live in a hotel, not even your own home. I think you're forced to live in a hotel for 2 weeks to quarantine yourself from the rest of society, which is funny because the virus by then had been in Canada for about a year. So yeah, the quarantine hotel would have made sense in March 2020 when the Canadian government repatriated thousands of citizens from different countries and had them fly back into Canada. That would have made sense if they were quarantined in 2020 in March. Didn't make a lot of sense in January 2023 when there was already community spread within all of Canada. So again, I would say very unscientific policies. It just made things just more difficult for people without good reason. Um, and then in mid 2023, another seismic event, a big shift happened, which was the introduction of the first group of vaccines. Right, so there were a group of pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. There was so Pfizer came out with a vaccine with this new form of vaccine that was I think it was called an RNA vaccine based on. So previously, vaccines had to use dead viral parts or dead or injured parts of a virus, and that's how you gain immunity. But these vaccines were directly changing your cells, I guess. Like I'm not a vaccine expert, but they were a new strand of I think mRNA vaccines was what they were called. Don't quote me on this. Again, I'm not an expert on vaccines, but there's a group of vaccines that were different in the type of how they function, and they directly change your cells, and they directly change the genetic messaging of your cells rather than introducing a dead or injured virus to your body. So there's a group of these vaccines, and then controversy, right? There was two types of controversy: groups of people who didn't want to be vaccinated and who thought the vaccine was because later on in 2023 the vaccine was essentially forced upon people. There were these things called vaccine mandates. So essentially you continued to live in lockdown unless you were vaccinated. So essentially the government created two classes of citizens: the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated. So there was in effect discrimination, but government sanctioned discrimination, that restaurants and public places were available only to vaccinated people, and you had to actually show proof of your vaccination. And non-vaccinated people were essentially prohibited from engaging in social life, in most avenues of society. They were essentially kept in lockdown. So if you imagine the lockdowns we experienced in early 2020, they were kept in those conditions, whereas those who were vaccinated were allowed to participate as members of society in a social manner, and that was highly controversial. So there were some interesting developments. I remember when the vaccine was first introduced, it was not available to everybody. So there was some triaging as to who gets the vaccine. So healthcare workers were the first people to get the vaccines. I think seniors were a group that were allowed to get the vaccine. First Nations people in remote communities, at least in Canada, that was the hierarchy. People like me, I was in my 30s, young, I guess relatively young person. I was not a priority. I was only allowed to receive the vaccine later. But at the beginning, it was very interesting. There was a whole big news article about this. There was a very rich man and his girlfriend, and they flew into a native reserve somewhere up in the north of Canada to get the vaccine. Right, these were people who were they wanted to get the vaccine, and they were doing everything possible, even taking private flights to get the vaccine, and it was very controversial. I think the person lost his job after because of the media attention, the negative media attention, because the general public was essentially saying you're skipping the line, right? You're taking this vaccine that should have been given to Native American, Indigenous Canadian people, and you skipped the line. You went to a native reserve to get this vaccine, which was really ironic because later on in the year, there, and especially in later on, there would be people protesting, saying that I don't want to be vaccinated. there would be groups, massive protests, anti-vaccine protests across the country. So it was very interesting that the media and everybody from all walks of life, they were shaming this guy for wanting to be vaccinated. Honestly, from my opinion, they should have made him the poster child of vaccination. Like, this guy is literally willing to pay for a private flight to be one of the first to be vaccinated. Well, you should be too, because later on the vaccine was not something a lot of people wanted. It was something that a lot of people did not want. So there's certain irony that this person was shamed for wanting the vaccine so enthusiastically, when later on the government had a hard time convincing another group of the Canadian population to get the vaccine when they were actively resisting. So it just depends on where you were. There were so many ironies in the story of the pandemic, depending on what time, where you were in this timeline. I got my vaccine in the summer of 2023. My girlfriend got it later. She did not want to be vaccinated. There were many reports that the vaccine had negative effects on women, especially on their menstrual cycles. And the medical establishment at the beginning denied it, and it was shameful that they denied it, because in fact later research showed that it did. But in the heat of the moment, the medical community essentially attributed these anecdotal reports from women to hysteria or anxiety or that very, very dismissive. And it was terrible. It was terrible that they dismissed the anecdotal medical recounting of women and what happened to their bodies. I thought that was very shameful for the medical community to do that in this spirit of just trying to push the vaccine onto the general population. I'm not anti-vaccine. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not an anti-vaccine person. But the way that it was pushed upon people, the discrimination that certain individuals experienced, I thought it showed the dark side of Canada, for sure. It absolutely showed the dark side of the country, right? Just later on, there would be the trucker protests, right? These truckers who didn't want to be vaccinated, and Trudeau would enact unconstitutional, and they were held by our Supreme Court to be unconstitutional policies to freeze people's bank accounts so that they could not support the protesters, to freeze the bank accounts of the protesters. So very controversial, very dark stuff that later on the courts deemed to be absolute government overreach and an unconstitutional exercise of government power because of protests. Different topic. It's a different topic, but it's related to the vaccine. The society became very divided. Became very, very, very divided after the vaccine was introduced, because some segments of society were vaccinated. Other members refused to be vaccinated, and they were treated as second-class citizens. And it caused rifts within society, within families, within workplaces. As an employment lawyer at the time, I got so many calls from people who said, I just got fired because I refused to be vaccinated, right? I just lost my job. Again, I'm not anti-vaccine. I was vaccinated. I got 2 shots myself. So I understand the utility of the vaccine. It's just that the way that it divided society, there must have been a better way to do this. It was just terrible to see that the way that it divided society. And on top of that, I felt betrayed to an extent, because even though I was vaccinated, many places, for some reasons, as I was traveling, at least later on, or maybe perhaps even within Canada. I don't remember if it was within Canada or travel outside of Canada. I think traveling outside of Canada, at the airports, I still had to show proof that I had a COVID test. So I often had to do. I remember in the fall of 2023, when fall winter, my girlfriend and I just left the country entirely for 4 months. We had just had enough of this, and we left the country. We went to Europe for a while, and then Panama and Costa Rica. I remember you still had to show that you had the vaccine. Sorry, not the vaccine. You had to show that you did not have COVID. So you had to show that you had a rapid test done in the previous 48 hours, even to board a plane. And I think that was true for Canada for sure. To leave the country, um, at the time you had to show that you were not infected with the virus, which was kind of silly. It's because they forced everybody to get vaccinated, and then you had to show that you didn't have the virus. And what was the point of the vaccination? To an extent, only from I understand. I understand the broad social implications and utility of the vaccine, but only from the perspective of travel, which is what I'm focusing on in this very narrow context. It was completely ridiculous that as a vaccinated person, then I also had to prove simultaneously that I did not have the virus. Right? Then why be vaccinated? Right? If I had to prove by way of a rapid test that I didn't have the virus in order to travel, then I would just prove that. But then why require the vaccination as well to travel? Because you were also required to produce vaccination records. So to get out of the country, I remember at the time, you had to produce both records that you were vaccinated and that you did not have COVID, which for me was very illogical. I felt again betrayed by my own government in terms of how silly and illogical these policies were. I felt a deep sense of betrayal and anger towards the government and its policies. And I think that's, for me, one of the unfortunate lasting legacies of the pandemic is I certainly became less patriotic. My view of Canada from being very patriotic, nationalistic, to a view of general apathy at the moment. If you'd ask me as of 2024 how I feel about my own country, somewhat just, and obviously there are a lot of issues, the economy and other issues, but I'm talking about just flowing from emotionally going through 2 years of lockdown and being controlled in different ways, and often subject to policies that I thought were illogical, or policies that the government implemented that really required more thought and were yeah, I think for me one of the lasting legacies was my sense of how my perception of the country changed emotionally. I survived. I survived the pandemic. Unfortunately, I think some people did not, and one thing that I wished would have happened, honestly, at the end, I think the pandemic ended more or less in 2023. I think by, was it? Yeah, but I think by 2022, more or less. By the beginning, if not the middle of 2022, it it had ended, and like people were allowed to resume their lives normally. I remember returning to Canada in March of 2022 from my 4 month trip with my girlfriend, and things were essentially back to normal. There were no further lockdowns. So it was 2 years, but March 2022 is 2 years from March 2020. There were 2 years of 4 or 5, subsequent lockdowns. So I wish there was a cathartic moment for us, in the same way that on Charles Bridge in Prague there was just a community gathering of people celebrating. I know there's obviously, that was too early on for the people of Prague to celebrate, because there was a resurgence, and I think they were under lockdown again at a certain point. So also it was too early for that celebration. But what I wish there was some cathartic community moment where the community came together and said, we survived this. Like as a community, as a group of people, it just kind of fizzled, right? We were under lockdown, and we were, there's all this tension and conflict in society over the vaccine. and then it fizzled. There was no, at the end of the Second World War, there was celebrations. At the end of the First World War, the armistice, right? There was celebrations. Bells were ringing, and people could gather and celebrate the end of this tragedy. There was no such thing for us. It was a very anticlimactic end. I think I understand from the government's perspective, they wanted people to be vigilant because new strains of the virus, starting with something called the Omicron strain. There was just so many different strains. I lost track, but there was different strains. The virus mutated, right? From the virus's perspective, which is really interesting. I had predicted this in my own mind. From the virus's perspective, the virus doesn't want to kill you. I think of it from the virus's perspective. The virus has no desire to kill its host. The virus just wants to reproduce. And the virus is not a living thing, so I'm referring to it as it. It just wants to replicate. It simply just wants to replicate. That is its purpose. It just wants to replicate. If it kills its host too quickly, it's actually not good for the virus. So there are certain viruses that burn themselves out because they kill their hosts too quickly. So there was a version of the virus that became quite prevalent globally at the end of 2022 called the Omicron variant, which was sort of a mutation variation of the original coronavirus that was very easily transmissible, right? Like everybody could get it. It was very, very transmissible, very virulent. It was very easy for you to catch this virus. It was almost like the common cold. It was like very easy, but it was not as deadly. And that was a really interesting thing. The virus evolved into a less deadly version of itself. And I think historically that's also what happened to the Spanish flu, that it evolved into a less deadly version of itself and now just exists endemically in the human population. It became sort of a version of the common flu. It evolved from a very deadly version to a less so deadly version because that's good for the virus. The virus now just exists endemically in the human population, can infect people, but it's not killing its host. By not killing the host can now transmit the virus to other people, right? To other members of the community. So the virus gets to replicate and gets to survive, right? Like us, the virus just wants to survive and replicate. Humans we just want to survive and replicate, right? That's if you think of evolutionary biology, that's all we want to do. We want to survive and replicate. We want to survive and reproduce. The virus wants to do the same thing. So the virus, I'm not surprised. It evolved into a less deadly version of itself, but a version that was very easily transmissible between people, which I think is sort of the ideal version of the virus from the virus's perspective, right? A version that can reproduce very quickly, move around, doesn't kill its host. It's perfect for the virus. So in a way, it became a win-win for humans and the virus. For us, it left us alive, and for it gets to reproduce and transmit and replicate itself more frequently. So at the end, we humans and the virus, we reached an equilibrium of sorts. After millions died, but we reached an equilibrium. And I guess from the government's perspective, they were promoting the third shot, the fourth shot. I got 2 shots of the vaccine, but I didn't get the third and the fourth shot. They were promoting essentially getting a coronavirus or a COVID vaccine like every season. And well, it's up to you whether you want to do that. But an equilibrium was reached. But going back to my earlier point, I wish that there, in 2022, maybe in the summer, or there was some cathartic moment of community release of 2 years of going through lockdown and tension and conflict within society over vaccines and other things, that there would be a moment we would bring the community together, and that just never happened. It was an anticlimactic end, as I said, where the virus just reached an equilibrium with us, and we now live with it. And the economic consequences of the lockdowns were devastating. I would argue certainly more devastating economically than the death that the virus caused, to shut down most of the world's economy for extended periods of time, and the inflation and the subsequent economic issues that came from it. obviously not just from the pandemic. There was a war in Ukraine after in February 2022, and other issues that global issues that arose. But the pandemic, we're living still through, I think, the legacy, the economic legacy of the pandemic. We're not in 2024. We're definitely not over that. It's the legacy, the public spending that happened um, during the pandemic, and that contributed to inflation and the debts that governments incurred. I don't think we've Canada and many parts of the world. I don't think we recovered from that at all. I think that legacy will last for quite a long period of time. So what did I learn from all of this? I mean, you obviously heard some of my commentary with respect to government policy and some of my disagreements over the policies the government, at least the Canadian government, enacted at the time. I mean, that's one thing I learned is just the speed by which policies can be implemented and how arbitrary they can be. That it made me reflect as well on existing policies, on anything, right? Our laws, just some of them are just arbitrary. It made me really realize how arbitrary some of our laws are and how the government can just change our laws just because. It certainly put that into perspective. But I think the biggest thing that I learned is the value of human contact, because we are ultimately social creatures. Ultimately, we are social primates, and not being able to attend events, go to restaurants, go to theaters, not able to at certain points in the pandemic, not being able to travel or having your travel rights significantly curtailed, made me really appreciate being able to go out with friends, being able to host parties again, being able to travel freely again. It made me realize that these things should not be taken for granted at all. They should not be at all taken for granted, because at one point they can be taken away from you. And the moment that you least expect, that something simple, something that we took for granted, such as meeting friends, going to social gatherings, seeing your own family, right? These things became difficult and sometimes even impossible during the pandemic. Traveling became difficult, and during certain points of the pandemic, impossible. These things that we, in 2019, that I took for granted, in 2020, 2021, they looked vastly different. So if I leave you with any lasting words of wisdom, is that whatever you're doing now, the things that you enjoy, do more of it. Do more of the things that you enjoy, because you don't know when you may not be able to do these things. Simple things, right? So at the time, for me in 2019, I didn't realize seeing my parents or seeing friends was going to be such a precious commodity, and that travel would be such a precious commodity, and just going to the theater, to the movies, or to the local restaurant, going to a community center, or playing sports. All of these things became such precious commodities. So think about that, because the world's going through some issues, and the issues will continue, and they may be different issues, different from the pandemic, but the things that you enjoy, whether that's the clean air, well, depending on where you are in the world, the air may not be clean, but at least we do have air. The air, the water, the technology we're using, the people around us, the human relationships, the land, the animals, our own mind, our own body, the fact that we have some level of free agency right now, the fact that we can think for ourselves, the fact that most of us, well, maybe not, most of us live independent lives. There's all of these things, right? With the rise of artificial intelligence and eventually sentient artificial intelligence, global warming, climate change, and the economic and environmental catastrophe that's going to bring, there's a lot of things that are going to change. I like to say that 2020 started the decade of troubles, and that decade is going to continue. The things that we enjoy now, at some point, may very well be taken away from us, either by the government or by some big catastrophe, or by way of some big technological change, or by way of natural disaster or war. Things we did not think to be possible in 2019 became very, very possible in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, going forward. So enjoy. Enjoy what you have. Enjoy the people around you. Enjoy your life. Enjoy every moment of it, because it can disappear. Be grateful, be kind, and live your best life. That's the end of the video. I'm living my best life. As you can see, I'm enjoying my life, and I got some gifts over here. Where is it? There we go. These gifts over here that they brought for me at the hotel. So I'm going to enjoy my life now, and I hope you do the same. And I will speak to you soon. Goodbye.